I bet you think you already know this story. You've seen the TikToks, the tweets, the headlines. A black girl is the one that truly inspired Betty Boop. Baby Esther Jones is her name, and I bet you think I'm going to retell you about the lawsuits and the white people who stole her style and identity. But no. Because what if I told you that that was the least disturbing part of her story? Here's what no one ever tells you. The real story of Baby Esther isn't about stolen art and identity. It's about a stolen childhood, exploitation, and the fact that she vanished seemingly without a trace. And what happened to her is darker than anyone could imagine. In 2021, PBS quietly removed a 2015 article that had long been cited as proof that Baby Esther Jones was the real inspiration behind Betty Boop. After receiving a legal threat from Mark Fleischer, the grandson of Betty Boop's creator and current head of Fleischer Studios, PBS admitted the claim was unverified. The network issued an apology, retracted the story, and published a correction explaining that the Baby Esther portion of the article could not be proven. But it's important to note that correction didn't come from a neutral source. It came from the family of the man whose reputation and livelihood are tied to Betty Boop's legacy, and that makes it complicated. At the same time, the push to reclaim Baby Esther's story didn't come from nowhere. For many Black historians, researchers, and artists, the idea that a young Black performer could have inspired one of America's most iconic cartoon figures fits into a long, painful pattern, where the creative work, image, and voice of Black performers were often borrowed, copied, or erased. The truth, however, may live somewhere in between. But this story is bigger than whoever inspired or even created Betty Boop, and it's quite dark. But due to the sensitivity of this story, I'll let you know that I got my sources based on what still exists. Things like old newspaper clippings, scattered magazine mentions, gossip columns, and fragments from books and court records. So, as I always say, take everything with a grain of salt. Now let's get into it. One of the main problems in this story is that this life, the life of Esther Lee Jones, is the epitome of erased, vanished, literally, treated almost as if she never existed. And if it wasn't for the few newspaper clippings that survived, buried deep in archives, and forgotten microfilm, no one would even know that she was once a living, breathing human being. To tell Esther's story is difficult because so much about her is unclear, vague, contradictory, undocumented, filled with inaccuracies, misconceptions, and sometimes outright lies. Over time, she's become more myth than memory, a ghost people argue over instead of a girl they remember. And yet, the pieces that do exist paint a disturbing picture, because what they show is that Esther Jones was, like so many children in show business, exploited racially, sexually, and emotionally. She was surrounded by adult men who controlled her image, her earnings, and her body. And that exploitation would eventually fuel one of the most sexualized cartoon characters ever created, which tells you everything you need to know about the minds behind it. We'll get into that lawsuit, the one that made her name infamous, but first we have to start where it all began, with the little Black girl from Chicago whose childhood was sold as entertainment. Like her death, no one really knows when Esther Jones was born. No birth certificate, no census record, no confirmed photograph, just speculation that she was born in the colored section of Chicago, anywhere from 1918 to 1921. The changing of birth years were often done back then to make one appear younger or older, depending on the entertainment circumstances. And that's how her story begins, not in legend, but in poverty, because everything about her life is a blur, except the part where grown men made money off a child. People love to say that Betty Boop was inspired by a Black woman. It's a comforting thought, the idea that a grown, empowered performer was the muse behind one of animation's most famous faces. But that's not the truth, because the real inspiration wasn't a woman at all. It was a child. Born to William and Gertrude Jones, Esther Lee Jones grew up in a segregated Chicago neighborhood where opportunities were limited but performance was a way out. William and Gertrude were stage parents and Esther's first managers, who paraded her around as what was called a Charleston dancer. And in 1923, at around 6 or 7, little Esther's life changed one night at a Charleston dance competition. In Chicago's Sunset Club, seeing this tiny little girl being able to kick and flip and twist like the adults made the crowd lose their minds. But ironically, back then, the Charleston was considered a very raunchy, salacious dance. So much so that this dance was banned in many places and events. The Charleston could be considered the twerking of its time, too sexual and too wild for polite society. And although that should have been considered inappropriate for a child to dance in such a manner, it's what got her noticed that night. In that audience was Lou Bolton, a Russian-American theatrical agent known for novelty acts. He saw Esther as a product. He convinced her father, William, to let him manage her, and within months she had a new name, Baby Esther, the little girl who could sing and dance like a grown woman. Lou Bolton, who had an entertainment school back in Pittsburgh and who had been in the business for 20 years, trained Esther in acrobatics, mimicry, and comedic timing, molding her into something he could sell to both black and white audiences. She sang adult jazz numbers in a baby voice, exaggerating vowels, rolled her eyes around in a silly manner, fluttering her lashes, moving her body just enough to toe the line between cute and provocative. During her act, Baby Esther would sing and scat wordless phrases such as boo boo boo, wada-da, doo-doo-doo, and eventually what would become the famous boop boop be doop. This was her unique take on what was already a popular genre of entertainment, and one that would make her stand out. And at this young age, Esther wasn't performing for children or even mainstream audiences. They had this little girl performing in after-hours clubs, in front of smoky, crowded rooms full of drinking, gambling, and burlesque shows. By this time, she was also starting to be billed as the baby Josephine Baker and the miniature Florence Mills. To most people today, that name means little, but Florence Mills was a celebrated Harlem Renaissance singer and dancer who rose to fame performing in adult nightclubs. Comparing a child to her wasn't a compliment. It meant Esther was being packaged as a tiny version of a grown black woman known for being risque and sensuality on stage. And the Josephine Baker comparison was worse because she was already known to be a wildly provocative Parisian performer famous for dancing nearly nude. For a little girl, those labels weren't signs of admiration. They were warnings of how far adults were willing to go to sell her, and her parents went along with it. Her father and manager didn't stop it. They encouraged it because it made money. And the more she performed, the more the line blurred between performance and exploitation. Newspapers described her as remarkably mature for her age. Audiences called her adorable. But nobody said the quiet part out loud, that this was a child being displayed for the gaze of adult men. The inappropriateness of this career situation would soon come to a head, but in 1928, everything unraveled. Bolton, along with Esther's parents, William and Gertrude Jones, was arrested after authorities discovered the 8-year-old performing at the Everglades Night Club until 3 in the morning. The case reached the Children's Court, where the headlines painted a grim picture of child labor exploitation. Esther was seized by the state and placed under the care of the Children's Society, which was the CPS of its time. While the 3 adults were taken to court to be seen by a judge, Lou Bolton spoke about how baby Esther had never had a teacher, nor had she ever gone to school. This revealed how her parents didn't prioritize her education, but instead her entertainment endeavors. This showed how none of the adults in her life had her best interest in mind. And yet, even after showing such negligence, soon after the arrest, you'd think someone would have stepped in, that maybe the authorities would have banned her from performing in adult clubs. But instead, Esther was quietly returned to her parents, the very people exploiting her, and it continued. Lou Bolton rejoined the family and decided it was a good idea to take Esther overseas for a European tour. He took Baby Esther's act from New York all the way to Paris, Berlin, and Madrid, where white audiences called her exotic and a marvel. A little 9-year-old girl, oceans away from home, dancing for adults who saw her as entertainment. But soon problems began. Within months, Esther's mother accused Bolton of stealing the child's earnings and cruelly started to pass Gertrude off as a maid to others on the road. He was quickly fired and replaced by a new manager by the name of Sidney Garner. Sidney Garner is the one who made Baby Esther an international superstar. It was now 1929, and she was performing in the very same theaters that had made Josephine Baker a sensation, the Moulin Rouge, the Casino de Paris, and the Winter Garden in Berlin. Posters called her Little Esther or the miniature Josephine Baker. And the crowds came, curious, fascinated, disturbed. Here was a black child singing and dancing with the confidence of an adult, half imitating and half mocking the glamour of grown women on stage. She was compared to Josephine Baker so often that some papers simply billed her as Baby Josephine. And that nickname, that marketing, was the entire appeal. White European audiences were obsessed with the image of blackness as wild, primitive, sexual, and here was a child acting out that fantasy on command. They could enjoy the thrill of it without confronting the morality of it. She wasn't a person to them, she was a spectacle, something to gawk at, praise, and move on from. In Paris, Esther performed for diplomats, kings and queens, artists, and businessmen who praised her talent while ignoring her age. In Berlin, she shared stages with chorus girls and jazz musicians twice her size. She wasn't surrounded by peers, she was surrounded by men, and every decision made for her was made by men. Sidney Garner controlled the bookings and the money. Her father stayed behind, sending letters and collecting payments, and her mother accompanied her sometimes, and sometimes she'd send her aunt to be with her. But the majority of the time, Esther was around men. There's no record of where she slept, how she was schooled, or whether she was ever safe. There are only playbills and posters, fragments of a life turned into advertisement. By 1930, she was one of the most talked about kitty acts in Europe and South America, and she was becoming a very wealthy black child, receiving $750 a performance, the equivalent of more than $12,000 today. That was unheard of for a black child from America, making that much money. She was able to go to fancy restaurants where her adoring fans would call for her and ask for autographs. Baby Esther was literally a star, but as much as Esther enjoyed what she did for a living, it wasn't always glamorous. Her performances drew crowds, yes, but they also drew stares. Those very same European newspapers that praised Baby Esther for her talents also showed that they were still racist towards her and also sexualized her. European papers wrote about her the same way they wrote about animals at the zoo. Many newspapers displayed this young child as what some would call jigaboos, pickaninnies and monkey-like animals. They gushed over her wild energy and natural rhythm. They also described her performances as seductive or flirtatious, words that should never be associated with children, words that disguised racism as wonder. Every article about her talent came with an insult about her skin and race. It didn't help that Sidney booked her alongside blackface performers, only cementing the horrible stereotypes of black people. But Esther's popularity continued to grow, eventually drawing in weirdo admirers. One of Baby Esther's many male admirers was a Dutch author by the name of Joe Otten. In 1932, Joe wrote a book titled Bed and Wereld about his dream encounter with Baby Esther and his infatuation with the 10-year-old. Joe admits that he was such a fan of Baby Esther's that he named his own daughter after her. In his book, he described the night he first saw little Esther perform. He wrote that it took place in a small provincial city, inside a modest theater where second- and third-rate artists usually performed. He claimed that Esther was traveling with her uncle, who also acted as her manager, although he was more than likely confusing this person with who was actually Sidney Garner. This means something because Joe also would make a claim about this supposed uncle. Joe said he met both of them that evening and later saw her backstage before her performance. That moment would become the foundation for how he wrote about her later in his book, a mix of memory, projection, and uncomfortable fascination. He remembers telling her a story about Captain Kitty in which she seemed to enjoy, and he asked for her autograph. Her quote-unquote uncle or Sidney told her to get dressed because it was almost time for her to go on, so Esther told Joe to leave. He explicitly told her that he wanted to stay and watch her get dressed. He writes that he went downstairs but stays where he can still peek on her in the mirror. He says, "It may have been cowardly for me to do that, but I was unable to resist the temptation." He then watched her with anticipation as she fully undressed, describing her as a brown, sweet angel, a child, slim and naked, a pure flower of youth and blooming flesh. He stated that he wanted to run upstairs and kiss her. Then, in his present tense, he wrote how he wished that she was there, lying close to him, close, very close. He was writing like he was still obsessed with her and still just as creepy. And when Joe wasn't reminiscing about his sick, twisted fantasy of Esther, he wrote about the danger that was surrounding her due to her race. Joe writes about her uncle supposedly being lynched while trying to protect Esther. What happened was the French-American nightclub didn't realize that they'd booked a black performer. So when she and her entourage came in, there was an uproar. Esther's uncle supposedly tried to defend baby Esther, but the Americans that were there took him out and murdered him by beating him to death. Joe referred to the lynch mob as filthy Americans and said they slaughtered him like an animal. Joe claims that after this horrific incident, he didn't know whatever happened to Esther. The last that he'd heard of her is that she was performing in Paris in a small club, and after that, he didn't hear about her anymore. It's probably because at this point, baby Esther was starting to age out. She was around 12 years old by now, and the older she was getting, the less valuable she was becoming. The baby branding that made her famous was also her expiration date. That image, the innocent, flirty child for all the European audiences, was wearing thin. She was a preteen who was starting to develop and grow, and her act was no longer seen as cute or even exotic. Her bookings became few and far in between, and by 1932, baby Esther went back to America, trying once again to survive off the only thing the world had ever let her do, perform. When Esther came home, she wasn't the same little girl who'd once stunned Europe. She was older now, somewhere around 14 or 15, and her baby act had stopped working. The curls, the ribbons, the childish lisp, it all looked wrong on a growing body. The audiences who once applauded her now looked away. For a while, she tried to find her place again. Harlem was alive with sound, brass bands, tap dancers, showgirls, and the electric swing of Cab Calloway. She joined one of his troupes for a short while, performing as Little Esther and the Sepia Dolls, a chorus of young black dancers who twirled behind the band while Calloway swung his baton. It wasn't stardom, it was survival. She was still chasing the only dream she'd ever been allowed to have, the one adults had chosen for her when she was barely old enough to spell her name. But the America she came back to was changing. The Great Depression had left theaters half empty, and performers desperate for work. And while Esther was fighting to stay visible, another performer was already succeeding in the spotlight that Esther had unknowingly inspired. By 1928, when baby Esther was already a sensation overseas, Helen Kane was America's new obsession. She wasn't the first to sing in a baby voice, but she was the first white woman to turn it into a brand. Carrying a stuffed animal, she had short bobbed hair, dimples, and a permanent pout. She played the part of an innocent child trapped in a woman's body. And audiences, disturbingly enough, loved it. Her entire act was built on contradiction. She flirted like a grown woman, but sang like a toddler. Reporters called her adorable, girlish, sweet. But everyone in the room understood the subtext. The Big Baby act was the perfect disguise for adult desire. It was the same formula that had already made baby Esther a novelty. Innocence sold as entertainment, sexuality disguised as playfulness. Only this time, it wasn't a child performing it. It was a grown woman pretending to be one, and that made it somehow acceptable. But the problem is that Kane's act wasn't entirely her own. She'd been inspired by a Paramount movie-tone short filmed at the Everglades Club in 1928, the same club where Baby Esther had performed, and where her parents and manager had been arrested for letting her perform after midnight. The film featured Baby Esther, then 8 years old, performing her nightclub routine, singing in her signature baby voice and scatting those same syllables. Kane watched, listened, and took notes. And within months, she was performing Esther's act on the vaudeville circuit repackaged in white skin and adult safety, and her career exploded. By 1929, she was touring nationally, starring in films and selling records, one of most popular songs being I Wanna Be Loved by You. Audiences had never seen anything like her, a woman who could sing like a child but move like a flapper. She called herself the Boop Oopa Doop Girl, and America couldn't get enough. Then in 1930, something big arrived. A new kind of performer was rising, one that didn't need food, rest, or protection, a performer that could be drawn, sold, and replicated endlessly. That performer was Betty Boop. Created by Max Fleischer and animator Grim Natwick in 1930, Betty was an animated flapper, a cartoon woman with the curves of Clara Bow and the squeaky baby voice of a nightclub singer. She was sweet and seductive at the same time, her garter flashing as she sang and winked at the camera. Distributed by Paramount Pictures, she became one of the first animated sex symbols and one of the most profitable cartoon characters of her era. America fell in love. Little girls wanted to look like her. Men wanted to own her. And just like that, the same nation that had once criminalized a real child for dancing in a club now celebrated a cartoon built on the same image. Betty Boop was booming and Helen Kane was very angry. Because when Betty's fame began to eclipse Helen Kane's, Helen suddenly wanted recognition. She filed a $250,000 lawsuit against Fleischer Studios and Paramount, claiming the cartoon had stolen her likeness and her voice. And that's when the ghost of Baby Esther was dragged out of obscurity one last time. Fleischer's lawyers needed a defense. They needed proof that Helen Kane hadn't created the Boop Oopa Doop. So they brought up a name no one had heard in years, Baby Esther Jones. They claimed that Kane had copied the style from Esther's act, and that Kane wasn't the originator at all. To prove it, they presented a reel of film, that same movie-tone short from 1928, showing a little black girl singing and dancing with a voice that would one day be credited to a cartoon. Her former manager, Lou Bolton, testified in court on Esther's behalf, saying he was the one who taught her the scat style, and that it wasn't Esther's either. He claimed that versions of it had already existed in vaudeville as far back as 1913, used by performers like Gene Green in early jazz, basically saying that Betty Boop and her scat wasn't inspired by either Helen Kane or Baby Esther. In the end, the judge ruled against Helen Kane and agreed that she hadn't invented the baby voice style, and she didn't own the famous scat. But the decision didn't settle authorship. It established non-exclusivity, not origin. The style, the syllables, the baby voice, the record shows they existed before Helen Kane, and that Esther performed them. It just doesn't tell us who first created them or who should have been credited. But some may ask, why wasn't Baby Esther able to go to court to defend herself? Well, this is the eerie part. By the time Esther's name resurfaced in court, basic facts about her life were already uncertain. She wasn't a part of the trial to defend herself because she'd literally vanished. This young girl, no older than 14 or 15 years old, literally disappeared from sight, and her whereabouts are still unknown to this very day. In late 1934, a notice was sent out to the courts that Esther Lee Jones had been declared dead by absentia. In legal terms, dead in absentia means a person hasn't been seen or heard from in so long that the law simply assumes they're dead. There was no body, no proof, no obituary, no hospital report, just an administrative declaration that said she was gone. And what made this even weirder is the mystery of it. No one knows who declared her death or if it was even true. There was no public documentation, cause, or confirmation. Someone, no one knows who, filed that paperwork. No judge's record named a petitioner, and the thing is, no family member ever corrected the record. None of Esther's relatives ever came forward to claim her story, to confirm or deny her death. Not her parents, not siblings, not cousins, no one. For someone who had filled nightclubs in Paris and Berlin, who was once called the successor to Josephine Baker, to simply vanish from history and from her own family tree is almost unthinkable. It's as if a stranger, somewhere in the bureaucracy, signed her life away. But why would something like this happen? Was it about inheritance or contracts? Maybe to close accounts left behind from her European tours? Or maybe something more sinister. We don't know. But the timing is suspicious. A teenage girl who'd been famous and wealthy overseas, back in America performing quietly in Harlem, and suddenly, legally she's filed as dead. But that's not just it either. Weirdly enough, what made it even more suspicious is that people still claim to see Esther alive. 3 years later, in 1937, a newspaper item surfaced claiming that baby Esther was still performing. No photos, no confirmation, no follow-up. Just a few printed words that open more questions than answers. If that report was true, it means she was declared dead while she was still alive. If it wasn't, it means her identity had already been stolen and her name was being used freely by others. We don't know, and since 90 years have passed, it seems unlikely that we'll ever find out what happened to baby Esther Jones. What makes Esther's story even sadder is that not only did she just disappear as if she never existed, in trying to tell her life story, the public, including historians, continue to get her wrong. Because so little verified information exists, almost every retelling has included a different baby Esther. Over the decades, newspapers, researchers, and later the internet attached new faces to her name, faces that had nothing to do with her life or even her era. One of the most common errors is the confusion with little Esther Phillips, an R&B singer who rose to fame in the 1950s. She was born in 1934, the year Esther disappeared and was declared dead, and yet countless articles and videos have used her photograph as if the two were the same person. Other images in circulation show adult vaudeville or cabaret performers, grown women whose careers occurred years later, captioned as Baby Esther. In reality, Esther Jones was a child throughout her public life. No authenticated photograph of her as an adult has ever surfaced. This misidentification has created a second layer of erasure for Esther Jones. And once again, the world remembers everything about baby Esther except who she actually was. The story of baby Esther Jones is not an isolated tragedy. It's a reflection of how the entertainment industry and the record keepers who follow it have historically treated Black performers as talent to be consumed, not lives to be preserved. In the early 20th century, few Black artists owned their likeness, their music, or their image. Contracts were informal, archives were inconsistent, and the press that documented their achievements often used racist caricature instead of respect. When those performers disappeared or died, there were no publicists or estates to manage their legacies. Their work slipped quietly out of circulation, leaving only rumors behind. Baby Esther's disappearance shows how that neglect operates at every level. A child marketed as exotic entertainment becomes untraceable the moment she is no longer profitable. A voice that influenced cartoons and popular culture survives without its source being credited. Then the myth of her death becomes accepted fact because the systems responsible for recording truth never considered her history worth protecting. Even in later decades, attempts to restore her story often repeated the same mistakes, using the wrong images, citing unverified claims, or reducing her to a footnote in the history of Betty Boop. What should have been a discussion about exploitation and racial inequality turned into an argument over ownership of a sound, and ownership in this industry has rarely belonged to the Black originators. The truth is that Baby Esther Jones should not be remembered only as the possible lost inspiration for Betty Boop. She should be remembered as evidence of how fame, built on Black creativity, can erase the very people who made it possible. Nearly a century later, the mystery of Baby Esther Jones remains. So, lurkers, what do you think? Have you ever heard of Baby Esther Jones and her being the original inspiration for Betty Boop? What do you think actually happened to her? Do you think something tragic happened to her? And what do you think about Betty Boop? Let me know down below.